The vampires they erased from history. The hidden rulers of Tartaria 050. Imagine standing in a vast library, one that stretches further than your eyes can follow, where every shelf is packed with leather-bound volumes, hand-lettered in languages that feel almost familiar, but not quite. Now imagine someone walking through that library with a torch, methodically, room by room, burning only the chapters that mention a particular name. Not the entire book, just the pages that would tell you who truly held power, who sat at the center of the web, who the merchants whispered about when the doors were closed. What you would be left with is precisely what we have today, a history that is almost complete. A story with a presence-shaped hole carved through its middle. That presence, that name, has been called many things across the centuries. In the oral traditions of Central Asia, it was spoken in metaphor, a figure who ruled without aging, who appeared at courts without invitation and disappeared before dawn. In the marginalia of illuminated manuscripts housed today in collections the public rarely accesses, scholars who have spent decades in those rooms have noted recurring symbols associated with what they describe as an administrative class that operated above the visible hierarchy of kings and generals. In the folklore of the Volga Basin and the Caspian Steppe, the stories describe figures of enormous authority who neither ate at the communal table nor stood in the sunlight of midday. Modern dismissal calls these legends. But legends, as any serious historian will quietly admit, are rarely invented from nothing. They are compressed memory. They are the archive that survived the fire. This channel has spent considerable time examining the cartographic evidence of Great Tartaria, that vast territory labeled across European maps from the 16th century onward as an empire stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific coast of Asia. We have walked through the implications of its sudden disappearance from official geography, its borders dissolving edition by edition across the encyclopedias of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Today we are asking a deeper question. Not just what Tartaria was, but who ran it. Not the visible khans whose names appear in the carefully curated dynasties we were permitted to study, but the tier above that. The administrative intelligence that seemed to persist across centuries, while the named rulers rose and fell like seasons. To understand this, we need to return to the maps, but this time we are not looking at the borders. We are looking at the symbols placed inside them. Jodocus Hondius, the Flemish cartographer working in Amsterdam in the early 17th century, produced some of the most detailed representations of Tartaria available to the European scholarly world. His maps are extraordinary documents, rich with notations about cities, trade routes, and the distinguishing characteristics of regional populations. But there is something else embedded in the decorative cartouches that frame his work. Something that art historians have noted without fully interrogating. The heraldic symbols associated with the ruling structures of Greater Tartaria include motifs that appear with uncomfortable consistency across cultures that should have had no contact with one another. A winged figure in profile, a serpentine line bisecting a circular field, and a particular arrangement of stars that recurs in the administrative seals of institutions built centuries later in cities as distant from each other as St. Petersburg, Philadelphia, and Calcutta. The question of why these symbols share such a family resemblance has been answered by mainstream scholarship with the word coincidence. But the more you look, the less satisfying that answer becomes. Petrus Bertius, the cosmographer to the King of France in the early 17th century, she wrote extensively about the organizational structure of Tartarian society in his geographical compendiums. He described a layered system in which the visible rulers, the khans and their courts, operated within a framework established and monitored by what he termed, in the Latin of his manuscripts, the custodians of continuity. Historians who have encountered this phrase in Bertius's work have largely interpreted it as a reference to a priestly or administrative class, a bureaucracy of record keepers. But Bertius himself used language that goes considerably further. He described these custodians as figures who maintained their positions across what he called impossible spans of time, who appeared in the records of one generation and resurfaced, seemingly unchanged, in the records of the next. He attributed this to spiritual authority, to a kind of divine mandate that the Christian framework of his era struggled to classify. We are not obligated to accept his framework, but we are obligated to take seriously what he was describing. Now move from the maps to the buildings, because this is where the theory gains its most physical and undeniable weight. Across the territory that was once labeled Tartaria, and across the cities of Europe and the Americas that were built or radically transformed during the 19th century, there is an architectural vocabulary that speaks of design knowledge far in advance of what the official timeline permits. The grand neoclassical structures, the cathedrals with their extraordinary acoustic properties, the star forts with their mathematically precise bastions, and all of these have been discussed in prior episodes as evidence of a sophisticated civilization that predates the history we were given. But there is a specific architectural detail that has not received the attention it deserves, one that connects directly to our subject today. In the older sections of cities from Prague to Samarkand to New Orleans, there are buildings with lower floors that sit partially beneath the current street level. The mudflood theory, which we have explored in depth before, proposes that a layer of sediment was deposited across these cities at the 19th century, burying the original ground floors. But there is a secondary observation that researchers have begun to make about these semi-subterranean spaces. In a remarkable number of cases, the submerged lower floors of these buildings contain rooms designed with no natural light, heavy stone walls, and ventilation systems that draw air from underground rather than from the exterior. They were not storage rooms. The architecture of these spaces, the proportions, the placement of alcoves, the presence of channels cut into the stone floors, whose original purpose has been classified simply as drainage, suggests they were designed for habitation by someone or something that did not require sunlight and did not produce the kind of biological waste that ordinary plumbing would address. This is the point where the theory of Tartaria's hidden rulers converges with the oldest and most persistent myth in human cultural memory. The figure of the vampire, the undead sovereign, the being of extraordinary age and capability who operates behind the visible hierarchy of human governance. Before you reach for the category of fiction, consider this. The vampire myth does not emerge from a single culture. It appears with striking structural similarity in the folklore of the Balkans, in the traditions of the Turkic steppe peoples, in the legends of the Carpathian regions that sat at the western border of Tartarian territory, and in the oral histories of Siberian indigenous communities who had no documented contact with European storytelling traditions. Every one of these traditions places the vampire not as a monster lurking in ruins, but as a figure of authority, a lord, a ruler, someone who commands loyalty and commands territory. The Slavic Strigoi was not a creature of the forest, so it was a creature of the manor house. The Turkic Ober was described not as a predator in the night, but as a figure seated at the center of trade and decision-making, someone whose longevity gave them an unnatural advantage in the long games of commerce and political influence. What if the legend is not metaphor? What if it is, like so many legends, compressed memory of something real? Not necessarily the supernatural being of cinematic tradition, but a class of individuals, perhaps biological, perhaps enhanced through means that our official science does not yet acknowledge, who possessed extraordinary longevity and used it to accumulate the kind of multi-generational power that ordinary human rulers can never achieve. A person who lives 3 centuries does not need to build dynasties through bloodlines. They simply outlast everyone who might challenge them. They watch empires rise and fall, absorb the useful elements of each, and reposition themselves within the new order while erasing the evidence of their presence in the previous one. The Encyclopaedia Britannica's earliest editions, those of 1771 and 1788, contain entries on Tartaria that are strikingly detailed about its territorial extent and its administrative sophistication. By the edition of 1824, the same encyclopedia treats Tartaria as a vague geographical expression rather than a political entity, and by 1842, the entry has been reduced to a historical footnote. This compression, this deliberate shrinking of an entire world into a parenthetical, happened across the span of roughly 2 generations. It happened at the same moment that the Russian Empire was completing its absorption of the Tartarian territories, that the British Empire was systematizing the rewriting of Asian history to justify its own administrative claims, and that the great world exhibitions were beginning to present a narrative of Western civilization as the singular heir to all human achievement. Someone needed the custodians erased. Someone needed the long memory to end. Consider what the 19th century's architectural renovation projects destroyed. In city after city, particularly across the Russian Empire and Central Europe, the urban renewal programs of the 1800s targeted precisely those structures most associated with the older administrative class. The underground chambers, the ancient towers, the buildings with those deeply buried lower floors whose function nobody could officially explain. The official reason given was modernity, progress, sanitation. But the selectivity of what was demolished and what was preserved maps with uncomfortable precision onto a project of erasure rather than improvement. The buildings that survived were the ones that could be repurposed into the iconography of the new order. rebranded as churches of a particular denomination, as civic halls, as museums curated to tell a specific story. The buildings that were torn down were the ones that resisted easy reclassification. There is a researcher whose work circulates in the communities dedicated to alternative history. Someone who spent years cataloging the underground infrastructure of pre-modern cities across Eurasia. Their findings, shared in document form rather than through institutional publication, describe a network of subterranean passages connecting buildings in ways that predate any officially acknowledged urban planning. These passages are not sewers. Their dimensions, their architectural detailing, their orientation relative to astronomical markers suggest they were thoroughfares, routes of movement designed for regular use by people who needed to travel between centers of power without appearing in the streets above. Whether those people were the Tartarian administrative class we have discussed in previous episodes, or whether they were something that preferred, for its own reasons, to remain below the surface, is a question the evidence alone cannot answer. But the passages exist. The architecture exists. The question is legitimate. When you walk through one of the grand neoclassical buildings that were supposedly constructed in the mid-19th century with horse-drawn carts and hand tools, try to feel the acoustic space of the interior. The way sound moves in those rooms is not accidental. The resonance, the specific frequencies that the domed ceilings and curved walls produce, has been measured by acoustic engineers who have noted that these spaces generate standing waves in frequency ranges that human biology responds to in measurable physiological ways. Lower heart rate, altered brainwave patterns, a condition that researchers in the emerging field of archaeoacoustics describe as receptive consciousness. These buildings were not designed merely to impress. They were designed to do something to the people inside them, to make them open, compliant, available to influence in ways that the ordinary transactions of speech and commerce cannot achieve. Who designed spaces with that specific capability? And for whose benefit were the people inside them made so receptive? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the investigative thread that connects the cartographic mystery of Tartaria, the architectural mystery of the mud flood and the impossible buildings, and the mythological memory of an undying ruling class into a single coherent inquiry. The vampire, stripped of its theatrical costume, is simply a being of extraordinary duration and capability who rules from the shadows while ordinary humans cycle through their generations in the light. Whether the Tartarian custodians were biological anomalies, members of a lineage with unusual longevity, practitioners of a preserved technology of life extension, or something our current scientific vocabulary cannot yet accommodate, the architecture they left, the passages they used, the legends that could not be fully erased from the folk memory of the people they governed all point in the same direction. We are not at the end of this investigation. We are barely at the threshold of it. The maps are still being digitized. The underground passages are still being surveyed. The acoustic properties of the old buildings are still being measured. And in the archives of institutions that do not invite public browsing, The manuscripts that Petrus Bertius and others consulted when they wrote about the custodians of continuity are still sitting, waiting for someone to ask the right questions in the right language to the right librarian on the right day. Look at your city with this in mind. Look at the oldest building you can find, the one that seems too grand for the era that supposedly built it. The one with the strange lower level that nobody fully explains. Look at the carvings above its doors and ask yourself what those symbols meant to the people who put them there. And then ask yourself what they might mean to whoever still understands them. The history we were taught is the surface of the water. This channel exists to look at what moves beneath it. If there are other hidden chapters you want to explore, the ones that were never assigned in any classroom, leave them in the comments. We will follow the evidence wherever it leads.